it is an absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Michael Tueller, who will be presenting a metrical search engine for poetry in ancient Greek. Dr. Tueller is professor of the classics in the School of International Letters and Cultures at ASU, where he teaches courses in ancient Greek language and literature. He works primarily in the Hellenistic period, the time after Alexander the Great, but before Augustus, when Greek language and culture spread broadly across the Mediterranean. At that time, the Greek people had to deal with their own discontinuity in space and time from their heritage, and with constant contact with very different and diverse peoples. In response, their literature became erudite, elusive, and strangely both nostalgic and cosmopolitan, sometimes at once. His research focuses on the ways that early Hellenistic epigrams played with the conceit of inscription, even when they were never meant to be inscribed. He is currently at work on a revision of the Greek anthology, which is the primary source for epigram. It contains about 4,000 poems composed over a period of more than 1,000 years. And that's for the Loeb Classical Library. While Dr. Tueller created a database for his dissertation work on epigrams and previously worked in data management for the US Navy, his work creating a metrical search engine for Greek and Latin is his first digital humanities project. Please join me in silently welcoming Dr. Tueller, and I'll hand it over to you now, Mike, and turn my video off, but thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, sure, happy to do it, yeah. So let's see, so I don't know who all is, let's see, maybe I can look at our participants list, know who all is out there. I don't think any of you are sort of aware of sort of how ancient poetry works. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the beginning, just to sort of show you what this is about, and hopefully it will not be too intensely dull. We'll see. Okay, let me get a screen sharing going here. So I do have a PowerPoint I want to use. Okay. Go. And let's get that started. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. Okay, so yeah, I've named the search since I submitted the topic. I've given the search engine a name because, as Liz pointed out to me, it really needs to have one. So I'm naming it after Hylas, who is one of the more famous people searched for in antiquity. Right, okay, so just a little background on Meter first. Right, so what I want to do is sort of show you a little bit about how poetry works by an example from an article I wrote a while back. This is a poem by a guy named Hermesianax, which is one of the earliest versions, at the top, one of our earliest versions of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. The poet Eurydice actually has a different name in this version of the poem. She's called Argiope. But you can see in the top selection that Argiope is brought back from Hades by the son of Oeagrus. That is Orpheus. Now, I just wanted to start with this to sort of show you the depths that some of us go to when we analyze Greek poetry. I'm focusing on just one word, the word anegagen, there at the top, which is translated brought back. Now, there's no particular reason most people have thought to look at this particular word. It just means brought back. That's obviously what Orpheus is doing. The word to bring back, anago, is an extremely common word. And in resurrection type stories like this one, it's essentially required. So who cares? It's just an ordinary word. What I did in my article was I said, well, yeah, but what about the exact form of this particular word? I mean, I know the verb itself occurs all over the place, but this particular form, is that anything special? And in particular, I looked back at Homer. When did Homer use it? Because that's a question that would immediately occur to everybody in antiquity as well, since Homer is the background for everything that they approach. And the answer is that Homer uses it exactly 4 times. And it never has anything to do with resurrection. It always has to do with seducing or capturing women. and in particular with the sort of bad consequences that might happen. And I'm giving you a passage beneath from the Iliad, where Achilles complains about exactly this, about Helen being captured, and about people being brought to bring her back, and this is leading into some of the worst problems that then sort of motivate the plot of the Iliad. So I argued on the basis of this that that particular word actually tells us a lot about the story of Orpheus as a whole, about how it's possible that Orpheus's mission to bring back Argiope will fail, that it will result in bad consequences for everyone. Now, the sort of final linchpin of my argument when I made it is that the word anegagen, every time Homer uses it, occurs in exactly the same sedes, S-E-D-E-S, the word that we use to talk about the metrical position in the line, that it always occurs right here in the fourth foot of the dactylic hexameter. And that's exactly the same place that it occurs here when Hermesianax uses it. That represents a sort of consciousness that Hermesianax knows that he's borrowing it. The reason I'm making this point is just to show that it does sometimes get very, very specific when we talk about people referring to one another. There is a real consciousness not only of their own poetic heritage, to the extent that pretty much everyone would have whole bunches of the Iliad and the Odyssey essentially memorized, but that this consciousness extended down to the very technical details, and those could be used to make a reference. This is then, right. This leads me to an article by Richard Thomas, came out in 1986, Virgil's Georgics and the Art of Reference. Thomas is making the point, is sort of analyzing the different ways that one could refer to, or as most scholars prefer to call it, allude to other works, and the ways in which these were done in antiquity. And in particular, one of his subtypes of the art of reference is what I've shown here. A special type of reference is what I would call a technical reference, by which I mean that the poet deals not so much in reshaping an entire line or number of lines, but rather through the use of a morphological oddity, rhetorical figure, metrical or rhythmical anomaly, or even by numerological criteria, intends to send his reader to a specific model. So these very technical aspects could be referred to by later poets without even a hint of the same words or the same setting, and hearers might be expected to pick it up given their own technical expertise in the poetry. But of course, how would you know? We would only know this ourselves if we had a similarly capacious knowledge of ancient poetry to what the audience would have in antiquity. That seems unlikely. Or if we had a metrical search engine. And that was what I intended to create. An engine that would allow us to search not for words in ancient poetry, but only for metrical patterns. And at first I thought, how hard could it be? We'll see how hard it'll be in just a second. Yeah, so a little bit of introduction to what ancient meter is. And for this discussion, I'm going to restrict myself to dactylic hexameter, which is the most common meter used in Greek and Latin poetry. My current program can scan for 2 different types of meter, but it essentially, it's very easily adaptable to other kinds. There's no sort of, the code itself is not meter specific. Okay, so a little quick primer on dactylic hexameter. This is a dactyl, a long, short, short. You might think dactylic hexameter would have 6 of them, but there is a catch, and that is for any dactyl, you could also substitute a spondy at any point, a long, long. So we often write each dactylic foot like this to show the choice, the option in there. And so a dactylic hexameter actually looks like this. The truth is that the last foot is required to be a spondy. So because there's essentially 5 option places in the line, that gives you 32 possibilities for different kinds of dactylic hexameter lines. So Now all we need to know is, well, how can we tell if a syllable is long or short? Greek is doesn't have a stress accent like English does. It is really a quantitative meter, whether the vowel or the syllable itself is long or short. And when we first teach students to scan poetry, we teach them a few simple rules, and here they are. And this looks like it should make it pretty easily. So if a syllable has a long vowel or diphthong, then it's long. If it has a short vowel followed by 2 or more consonants, it's long, unless those 2 consonants are a mute followed by certain semivowels, in which case it could go either way. Short vowels followed by 1 consonant or no consonants are short, and then the last syllable in the line always counts as long. So just a quick example of how that looks. Here's a line from the Iliad. And as we look at this line, it doesn't really matter whether the consonants that we're looking at are in the same word or a following word. So we break it up something like this in order to analyze longs and shorts. Let's see. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look for is dedicated long syllables. That's rule number 1. Omega and eta are always long, and so we pick those out, and that gives us a few syllables that are definitely long. We can look for some diphthongs, and we have one of those as well, ois. It's actually fairly easy to look for diphthongs. Certain combinations of vowels are always diphthongs unless specifically marked otherwise. So it's really fairly easy for the computer to find those. Now short vowels followed by 2 or more consonants, that picks up 2 more syllables as long. Actually, yep, there they are, umph and air. The first syllable also counts as long by that standard because the letter xi that ends it counts as 2. So I simply had to tell the program that particular consonant counts as 2, and then it would put everything together fine. All right, so short vowels. One of the short vowels that we just marked as long, epsilon followed by tau rho, the second to last syllable, that's one of those mutes plus certain semivowels, and so we're going to go back to marking that a question mark instead, according to rule 3. Rule 4, well, epsilon and omicron are always short, and we have a few of those followed by 0 or 1 consonants, so those are going to be marked short, and everything else then has to come out that we don't know. The last syllable was already taken care of as long by rule 5. Okay, so we've got 4 syllables marked that we don't know, and at this point, all I have the program doing is simply saying, well, which of the 32 possibilities for a line could possibly fit? And with so many fixed points, it's no surprise that there's only one, and it's this one. So that is how it would analyze that line. Now, with just what I've shown you so far, it's able to analyze, the program I wrote was able to analyze 75% of the lines in my sample text, which was a selection from the Iliad. So far, so good, but getting beyond that, there were plenty of challenges. And I'm going to go through these with sort of increasing speed as I go along here, because ultimately the solution ended up being perhaps different from what I expected, at least. So here's one line with too many question marks. 2 possibilities could be found here. And for this, I had to start introducing a dictionary. I had to start telling it, well, certain words, the syllables that we don't know about, we know whether those are long or short. So in fact, this one has to be the second of the 2 possibilities that the program discovered. It couldn't be the first, just due to the shape of the word. So I've already introduced a dictionary of Greek words, just a few of them. When it recognizes a word from the dictionary, it knows whether it's got longs and shorts on its hands. Worse is something like this. This actually won't match any of the possibilities. It would essentially throw an error in the program as I had it currently written. And the reason for that is the syllables I've marked in red here are long syllables according to the rules I just gave you, but basically when a long syllable is followed by a space, and then another syllable without any consonant in between, sometimes that syllable will shorten. And this is called epic corruption. So those syllables had to shorten. As soon as we figure that out, then it has to move on. So it's already clear that at this point, it's starting to sort of mess with the rules. And the problem is the number of ways in which you could make things difficult for yourself multiplies as you try to get down to the last few difficult types of lines. So here's just the ways that Greek lines cannot exactly fit the normal rules for a dactylic hexameter. Sometimes two vowels become one. They merge into a quasi-diphthong, which is something we called synesis. Sometimes a vowel turns into a consonant. Sometimes epic corruption happens even inside a word. I just barely define that as happening only between words. Sometimes even a single consonant will lengthen a preceding short vowel. And then sometimes things that just should be long or short and vice versa. So obviously with that last one, you can see that we're now entering the area of, you can just throw up your hands, or so it would seem. And all that I would, for a while I was programming this to essentially work these rules down in descending order of priority, so it wouldn't invoke this last one unless it absolutely had to. In Latin poetry, it gets actually even worse, and the tool is now scanning both Latin and Greek poetry. So in Latin, you have to have a dictionary right away because the vast majority of syllables are actually uncertain. And a dictionary doesn't always help because frequently words of the same spelling will actually have different long and short profiles. There's something called elision, where sometimes syllables just disappear. They don't always mark their diphthongs. So again, a dictionary has to be invoked to show when those syllables are diphthongs and when they aren't. And sometimes lines appear to be just an extra syllable long, which actually proved to be one of the hardest things for me to code. Okay, and ultimately the solution I had to invoke for this ended up being very simple. I haven't programmed it to be able to discover all these things. Instead, what I've done is I had it work from the lines that it could figure out, and then essentially take the syllables it had discovered and their behavior, and I invoked some sort of light artificial intelligence at this point to just have it predict, based on the survey of the lines that it had done before, what each syllable was likely to do, and then multiply it out for each branching path of the syllables to determine the most probable branch for a line to occupy. And the truth is now that's really all it's doing. It now just immediately invokes this very long list of syllables, of different kinds of syllables, knows the chances they are of being long or short, and then assigns those chances to each direction and goes from there. The only sort of snag I reached with this is that it wasn't always getting it right. And to correct that, I simply said, well, we know there are certain authors who are exemplars for these texts. And if I simply make their texts weighted about 2 orders of magnitude more heavily than the other texts, then maybe I'll get more compliant readings. And in fact, everything snapped right into place as soon as I did that. Okay, well, so far so good. Now this can find 32 different kinds of lines and can find them one after another. But this is only what we call the external metric. And now's the point where things start to get really complicated, because it's only when we get to the next step that we get to the things that are really of interest for people who study ancient Greek and Latin meter. And that is word division. Word division occurs at certain points in a line and doesn't occur at other points in the line. So for instance, the 2 things I've marked with arrows to the left here represent 2 two places where almost every line will have a sense pause. As you can see, we've got technical language already. The penthemimeral caesura is what this is called, which means essentially the break in the middle of the fifth half foot, so 2.5 feet into it. So at some point in the middle of that foot, in areas that are labeled masculine and feminine, because I don't get to make up the names, there's going to be some break. Now, in a few lines, there isn't. And in those few lines, they'll use what's called the hepthemeral caesura, which you see coming in from the right, exactly 1 foot later. Another place where there's often a break is what's called the bucolic diaresis, which you see with the green line coming in from the bottom right. And one place where there essentially never is a break is something called Hermann's bridge in the middle of the 4th foot. So these are just some of the very basic things that a line will do beyond just having the right meter. But the truth is that in the period that I study, these rules multiplied enormously as very technically accomplished poets literally made up more rules for them to follow to make it harder for them to write poetry, with the goal of it being so much more of a show-off, essentially, if they manage to pull it off. And this is a very sort of succinct list. I'm not going to go through these because they get very technical immediately, but a very succinct list of the types of rules that were made up and then obeyed or disobeyed by various poets according to their inclination, as they wrote their poetry. Now, if I can get my program to be able to figure out word breaks and mark where word breaks are, then it's going to be easier for us to discover other possible rules like this, and consequently other ways that poets were invoking anomalous metrical phenomena. This is exactly the sort of thing that Richard Thomas was talking about in his article. But there's a big problem with that, and that is that not every word break is a word break. Sometimes spaces between words don't actually represent a break between words because some words stick to one another. This is a list of some of the words types that stick to one another. This ends up being several hundred words. And it's not always easy to tell because some of them look identical to words that don't stick or to words that stick in the opposite direction. So this took an awful lot of work that is in fact still ongoing with dictionary building to be able to get this right. Okay, so I have actually, so I could talk about a little bit about some stuff that I have done with this, but I see I've been going for 15-ish minutes already so far. So why don't I pause at this point and see if people have questions or what we want to do here. So.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm just unmuting for a second to see if anyone does have a question to go ahead and pop it into the chat. We could also, if we don't get any questions in the next minute or so, we could also turn to maybe you describing a little bit more of the digital interface.
Sure. Yeah, you want to like show it and something like that?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay. So yeah, wait a minute for questions.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do some show and tell. That sounds
okay.
Good.
Sure. All right, let me bring up an example here.
We do have a question in the chat, but I think show and tell first, and then this question would be good.
Okay, great. Right, so let me share a screen here again. Okay, I hope you all can see that. I can't quite tell. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, so this is the basic interface as it looks right now. And this is currently online at highloss.org. You can essentially to work it, just click the search. You need to tell it how many lines in a row you want to search. I'll just say 1 for the time being, but you can put in any number of lines in a row that you'd like to do. Right, so at present we only have 2 line types that it's searching, dactylic hexameter and what's called elegiac pentameter. And so if we were searching more than 1 line, it would give us this option for each. Let's go ahead and search dactylic hexameters. And it now allows us to pick what it is that we want to do here. The truth is, let me just say, underlying, the code underlying the choice I'm about to make here is actually much more flexible than the interface here actually allows. I could actually use this code to search for any possible combinations of longs or shorts. It's just that I wanted the interface to be able to sort of help the user along by designating in advance what types of things we're searching for so that we'll get this. So it's just easier to manage. Okay, so you get 2 choices. You can have a dactyl, a spondy, or you can tell it I want it to have either kind. It can go either way. So let's say we do this, a couple of dactyls, spondy, actually makes this, let's make this a choice. And dactyl and spondy. The last foot, like I said, has to be a spondy, so we've really only got 5 choices. All right, so that's what we need to search at this point. Click next, and it'll now ask us, okay, so this is the point where it asks us what sort of breaks we want in the line. It's got our long, short, and short, and at each point gives us an option whether to have a break represented by a comma or a bridge represented by this arch. You could also just have no choice, and then it won't care one way or the other whether there's a break there or not. So for instance, let's look for only things that have a break here after the long in the 4th foot. Okay. All right, this is the point where we get to choose which text we're going to look in. There's triangles so that you can determine, drop down which sorts you want to choose. So if you want to do all the texts, all the Greek texts, or just a selection, some of these have works within them and so on. I'm gonna go ahead and search everything. There's a good large selection of both Greek and Latin texts here. Pretty much all the major texts are here and a number of minor ones as well. Okay, but we're gonna search through everything and just see what we get. So it's not actually searching at this point through those texts itself. Rather, I've sort of I've pre-processed all the lines, so it already knows what the various lines are. And this is what it's finding. So gosh, there's nothing in Homer whatsoever that matches that particular pattern. I'm actually finding that really interesting, but I don't think I have time for making discoveries right now. Yeah, anyway, so you can look at a number of different entries. Hesiod, oh no, here it is. They're putting Hesiod before Homer. So yeah, Hesiod, Homer coming in here, and so on. These are all the lines that we found that meet that pattern. It shows the citation for the line. There's the line itself and the exact metrical pattern, including breaks that this has. Let me actually just go through this one line because you can see from it a lot of how those word breaks work into it. Opse de min hetairos aner idin ophthalmoisin. Opse is a real word, but de, and min all bind in different directions. De binds back, de binds, they all bind in one direction. De, and min all bind backwards. So this should scan as only one word. Opse de min, and there it is. There's our first break in the line. Everything before that essentially counts as one word. Anyway, yeah, so that is basically what it will show you. And here's some, Latin lines doing the same sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Mike. This is normally the part where I would say invite applause. So if anyone wants to use their reactions to applaud, that would be amazing. And I'll go ahead and I'll ask this first question that's in the chat, and then maybe invite questions from everyone else. Go ahead and pop it in the chat or raise your hand using that Zoom function. So from Lauren Whitby, was it always your plan to do both Greek and Latin, or did one project lead to the other?
So eventually, yes, I wanted to do them both. I started with Greek because I thought it would be easier to code, and it was at the beginning for sure. I wanted to do both primarily because this is one of the few times in the classics where you can definitely search both Greek and Latin with the same, exactly the same tool, where you're looking for exactly the same thing. There's actually a fair amount of controversy about whether it's, it's not controversial with me, but there's a fair amount of controversy about whether Latin poets can ever quote Greek poets because they never literally use the same word. It's a different language. And so some people will say, well, they're only adapting whatever came before. They're never really quoting. But in the case of metrical phenomena, no, you can actually really quote an ancient poem. And so I was kind of hoping that this would provide some evidence as far as that goes. And since Latin poets are, notorious for wanting to borrow and imitate from their Greek predecessors, I thought, that'd be, I definitely wanted to, at least eventually to get those in there.
Thank you, Mike. We have a question from Selena Asuna who says, thank you, Mike, so cool. And then, is this something you get to work with your students through? If so, how do they engage with it? So and I'll add on just really quickly to how do you see students engaging with it in the future once it launches publicly?
Right. Well, the worst way students could engage with it is to cheat on their metrical scanning homework, because we always give them that when we teach them poetry. But anyway, yeah. So that's one thing you could do. But how my students engage with it? Actually, I am hoping. I mean, I do. At least in advanced classes, in 400 level classes. Unfortunately, we don't have graduate classes here, but the same would apply for those. It is important to search for when poets are referring to one another, especially with the poetry of the periods that I study, because it's so common. And so I am hoping that when students find something that they think is likely to be a reference to something else, that they will look for. I mean, actually, let me give one interesting example, and this is, let me grab the screen back here, and I will, this is going to take a second. This is an example of something I worked up for a presentation I'm giving myself. Share screen. Okay. Right, so so a couple poems here at the top. Both of these, this is the entire poem in each case, just a 4-line poem. And the poem at the top, as you can see, several centuries later than the poem at the bottom. And this is a fairly common poetry type. Niobe very frequently made it into fountain statues, even in our own period. And as we know, Niobe had 14 children, bragged to the gods about it, and they killed them all. And so we show them being turned into stone with this image. And so here's a poem that is designed for a statue of that type. And as you can tell from this poem, Niobe is emphasizing numbers a lot. She's talking about how many times she was a mother and that she has that many children and now there are that many stones. And of course, it begs the question, this is not the correct way to use begs the question regardless, the question, how many stones was it? Because numbers are important and she never gives the number. But if you look down at the bottom, I've given the metrical pattern here. So exactly 4 lines in exactly that pattern doesn't occur very often. But this poem, the next poem beneath it, is one time when it did occur a few centuries earlier. And in this poem, it ends with a number, and there it is, 14. And so I would argue that, you know, perhaps Lollius Bassus omits the number, knowing that people can refer to it because his poem is an exact metrical imitation of another poem that has the number in it. And so that's the sort of thing that I'm hoping, at least, students will be able to discover for their papers and things like that.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we got to see a little bit more of the poetry too. Thank you.
Yeah.
And again, and Selena says thank you too. Any other questions, you know, raise your hand or be sure to type it in chat, but I have some questions. I hope you don't mind me asking. I'm working through something, there's a question coming about like macro and micro views and distant and close reading, but that's gonna be in a minute because I'm still working it out. In the meantime, I have, towards the end of your presentation, you started talking about discovery a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And I have had the pleasure of knowing about this project for a little bit. And I always thought of it as a search tool, but now I'm thinking of it more as a research tool, not just for students, but for people. And I wonder if, like, I've worked on a lot of search engines where we call them search and discovery tools, but we never really define what that means. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you see this tool as a discovery tool. And you've talked about it a little bit, but any more? Like, what's the difference between search and discovery for you?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm not sure I know. I mean, on the one hand, so, okay. I guess one, as I'm sort of analyzing my own meaning in that, I mean, the thing that I'm really presenting to you here really is just search, right? You're telling it you want to find something, and then it'll go and turn it up for you. And you'll only be able to really make any discoveries about it if you already have some kind of intuition that something might be there. Right, and so you search to kind of confirm that something would be there, but the engine that's running the discovery of the engine that's creating the meter, right? The engine that is literally reading the poems and turning them into longs and shorts and word breaks, that can be used more capaciously. So, for instance, one thing that isn't there in the interface, but that I can do with it, is that I can literally just download all of Greek meter into it, and Greek and Latin meter into a single document. Okay, so I have one document with all of these 200,000 lines, all of them broken down by exactly what they're doing. And once you have that, then you can do database work, right? And you can start to say what relates more to other things, things like that. So on sort of not with that whole 200,000 lines, but with a smaller set. I've done some work on this author named Theognis, trying to discover if he has any metrical rules of his own, right? So can I add to that list of nitpicky metrical rules anything that is just Theognis, that only he does? And in fact, I did find something. So for this, I had to, what I essentially had to do was do statistical correlations between different points of the line to see if any one metrical phenomenon correlated with any other metrical phenomenon at any other point in the line. And doing that, I was able to discover that there's a particular metrical configuration that he consistently avoids, not 100% of the time, but pretty close, that none of his contemporaries or other people writing in his genre cared about in the least. And as a consequence, if you can find some, well, unfortunately, you can't use this to say something is Theognis, but it's pretty easy to use it to say something isn't Theognis, which is important because his corpus is actually very jumbled with a lot of other stuff. And so I've been able to take about a third of that corpus and say I feel pretty high degree of confidence it isn't his. And that's something, right? I mean, so that's a real discovery.
That's perfect. I think that's exactly what I meant by like, what is discovery with this tool and or with tools like this? So thank you. And then again, pop into the chat if you have something, but I have some more questions too. So I'm still shaping this a little bit, but I think that something struck me where there was a phrase that you said, like consciousness of technical details, right? And I feel like a lot of the text mining worlds kind of focus on distant and close reading is about like a consciousness of details in a way, right? So I think there's a trend now to say distant reading allows us to then do closer reading, that, you know, so we can make meaning, right? We do close reading to do distant reading to do, right, close reading again. But there's something that Ryan Cordell said where he said that like the micro view is actually not more true than the very familiar macro view. And that quote kept coming up for me as you were kind of talking about the things that you were discovering, right? Because I think what one of this project's like real truths is that it lets us look at the macro views in a new way. Right. I don't know if you have any feedback on any of that, but those are the things that were popping around in my mind. I think that there's something about like there's discovery there, but also reading.
Yeah. I don't know if this will really answer your question, but I will say, I mean, so one thing that happens fairly, this might seem hard to believe, but this kind of extremely technical metrical work has been going on for a very long time. And without computers. And so people have, you know, literally been scanning these lines and have sort of been marking longs and shorts and word breaks and things like that, and reaching conclusions about the metrical rules that I put on the screen for a long time. And I'm hoping that one thing that this will do, as it looks at sort of as we move to a sort of a more macro stage for a moment, is to sort of confirm to what degree these things are real. And part of what's going on when I say, are they real, is there are some things that have been noticed by scholars where they have confirmation bias. Okay, so for instance, here, let me bring up the screen here for a second. So this is, so this is a little bit about that discovery thing I mentioned. I'm not gonna be referring to the bunch of text here, but this particular type of lines here, this is an elegiac couplet with a dactylic hexameter at the top and an elegiac pentameter next. And there's this big break in the middle where there's always a break, and we know that rule says so. And so every scholar has said, yes, 100% of the time, there is a break there. But the problem is, if you pan way out and you look at the actual rules, sometimes that break does come in between two words that actually technically binds to the word before or after them. So in other words, no, by the standard you'd use anywhere else in the line, that doesn't count as a break. And those words would never occur, say, at the beginning or end of a line, respectively, because they bind too closely to the word before them. So in other words, what this shows macro level is that those binding, we call them clitics, proclitics and enclitics, these binding clitics, they form a bond that is not quite as strong as a regular word. That is allowed to be broken at some points and not at others. And here's the point where, you know, computers are a little bit superior to people. It's going to say, nope, those are the rules. Those are literally the rules. And you can't just say, I don't want it to be this particular time, which is what scholars have consistently done. So that's sort of one conclusion that you can sort of reach, sort of macro level. And then, you know, again, once you discover these things on a larger scale, you can then bring it back down to individual authors, because none of these rules are rules. All of them, I mean, it's poetry, right? All of them are broken at some point or another. And so finding out who's willing to break rules and where and when and which rules gets you down to the level of individual authors. And then the real close reading starts, right? So what is the matter of their style and things like that. There's one time, this is sort of pre this tool, but there's one place that has a minor bridge in the middle of the dactylic hexameter line. They don't like to break it exactly in the middle. And there's one poet I was studying named Phanocles, who we know is extremely tight. He very, very closely follows the rules, and he had a break there. And it's, it's not forbidden, but it's a little weird. And so a lot of questions between me and my editor came up. It's like, well, why do you think there's a break there? And as I looked, the break occurred right between two words that meant unbroken thread. And so obviously his sort of technical work in the poem is ironizing the content of the line. So that's close reading for you, right? But this very technical stuff gets into it at that point.
Thank you so much for answering my actual not question with a really cool insight. Thank you. And so I think our last question for the day is actually from Shannon Lujan. Thank you, Shannon. Her comment first is, this is way cool. And then as someone who knows only little about poetry and nothing about Greek Latin poetry, your tool makes me want to explore more. My questions are, and there are 3 of them, and I think what I'll do is I'll ask them in order and then let you respond. So the first is, how long did this take you to build?
Sure. As is usually the case with these things, it takes more time for the smaller parts. I mean, so the initial code, from the moment I decided I was done theorizing this and needed to start coding it. So from that point to 75% of the lines scanned properly, took me honestly about a day, not that bad. To then get it to 95% coded properly took me another 4 months of admittedly occasional work. And then to get it to 100% required completely reconceiving the project, because that was when I needed to make it essentially AI based on a massive list of syllables instead of being rule based according to the rules that we teach our students. So at that point, the project is completely reconceived and most of it rewritten. That took another 3 months. The interface was done with a partner from a grad student from computer science named Anoop Bakana. So he did all of that in the course of about a semester. So the part that you were literally able to see did that. And the rest it's still ongoing. Right now I'm still doing the work of building dictionaries. I'm still doing the work of figuring out when certain words that can be proclitics or enclitics, figuring out which way they go. That takes literal close reading and input, because in order to do otherwise would require a computer that can grammatically read the line. And there are a lot of people working on that whose work I really respect, and it is not close to being able to do what I needed to do. So that's still ongoing, but that's literally just data entry, bit by bit. Yeah.
The second part of Shannon's question is, what sort of background did you have in the technology?
So that's a really good question. So I'm one of those really nerdy kids who was programming through high school. And so I programmed there. My first job, my first thing that looked like a real job and was not a paper route was while I was in high school. I got hired by the local university to do programming for making lasers. And so I was doing Fortran programming when I was like 16, 17. And then I kind of stopped doing the programming. I worked with tech a lot in the Navy, but never did any actual coding. Obviously didn't want to program in Fortran for this. So decided I needed to pick up Python to do it. But you know, I sort of had, I knew how coding worked. I had the basic mindset for it. I really just picked up a Python manual and started saying, well, I need to do X, how can I do it? Figure it out. It took me, I was learning as I was going along. So, you know, I'm still learning from the manual as I go.
Thank you. And then the last part of Shannon Lujan's question is, did creating this project help you find the answers you were looking for, or did it produce more questions?
Both. Yeah, so I mean, I was hoping, I mean, so one thing, the first search I ran as soon as the whole tool was working is I wanted to answer the question, does anybody ever reproduce the first line of the Iliad exactly, right? I mean, like completely exactly. In those 200,000 lines that I've got in my database, is there ever any that reproduces not just the longs and shorts, but every word break? And at least, I mean, I hadn't properly coded all the enclitics and proclitics at that time, but astonishingly the answer was no. I mean, even though it's the most famous line of poetry in the entire period, nobody had ever reproduced it exactly. So yeah, I got an answer to that question. The answer was no. But I'm really interested in, you know, taking some of our more conscious poets and asking this question about them. What I would love to do would be to just literally look for every time any, say, 5 lines in a row exactly match any other 5 lines in a row in the entire corpus. Unfortunately, I mean, if you know any programming work, you realize that the size of that task is exponential. I mean, it would take, honestly, you know, I mean, I did it for 4 lines with a lot of restrictions, and it took about a day. To do it for 5 lines through the whole corpus could take months. And so, yeah, that's hard. And even then, you wouldn't know whether what you found was significant until you went and did the close reading and checked. So I haven't really done that. But again, you know, the more question stuff, you know, one of the things I'm really interested in is the couplet that I just showed you. All scholars agree that those couplets are a unified whole, that we should treat them not as 2 lines, but as one. No scholar has ever treated them as one metrically. That has never happened until the paper that I couldn't give last month because COVID. So, you know, that needs to happen, clearly. And, you know, I did get some answers to that, but, you know, more questions at the same time.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I think, you know, we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to take a second to, again, just thank you so much for joining us. I think the one thing that I'm taking away from today is actually that, like, the rules of language are meant to be broken, which makes me really excited. And then we can find out the ways in which they're broken and what kind of beauty that makes, right? So thank you. I'm going to